Hey X, I used to work at a secret lab in Siberia named Kholm-24 back in the 80s and 90s. This is my story. Every names or other details were changed, of course. The place was a hellhole, and I witnessed some seriously messed up shit there. Figured I'd share my trauma with you all, maybe it'll be therapeutic or something. Also, if anyone has questions, I'll try my best to answer. Here goes nothing. I got the job at Kholm-24 through a friend of a friend. You didn't apply to work there, you were chosen. They liked my background in biochemistry and I needed the money. When I first got there, I thought it was just a regular research facility, but soon I realized it was anything but. The place was massive, buried deep in the Siberian wilderness. The winters were brutal, and the isolation was maddening. The facility was split into several sections, each one more secretive than the last. I worked in a part called Sector 3, where they conducted behavioral studies, at least that S what they called it. When I arrived, I was given a tour of the facility. The security was tight, with armed guards everywhere and cameras watching our every move. They took my picture and assigned me an ID badge that I had to wear at all times. The badge had a chip in it that tracked my location, so there was no way to go anywhere you weren't supposed to. I was introduced to my supervisor, Dr. Ivanov. He was a stern man in his 50s with a permanent scowl on his face. He explained that our work was highly classified and that any breach of confidentiality would be met with severe consequences. He didn't have to elaborate, the unspoken threat was clear. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time reviewing old research and familiarizing myself with the Lab S procedures, but then they started bringing in the subjects. The experiments were some Frankenstein-level shit. They brought in all kinds of subjects, animals, prisoners, even children sometimes. They'd inject them with all sorts of chemicals, expose them to radiation, and do other things that still give me nightmares. I remember one project where they tried to create some sort of hybrid creature by splicing human and animal DNA. The results were grotesque. One night we were ordered to work overtime on a new batch of subjects. They brought in these prisoners from a nearby camp, rough-looking guys who didn't seem fazed by much. We injected them with a new serum and locked them in a room together to observe. At first, nothing happened. Then, about an hour later, they started screaming. It wasn't just pain, it was pure terror. Their bodies twisted and contorted, bones snapping and reshaping. By the end, they didn't look human anymore. I remember another experiment where they tried to enhance human abilities. They brought in a young soldier, maybe 25 years old, in peak physical condition. They strapped him to a table and started injecting him with a cocktail of drugs. At first, he seemed fine, but then his muscles began to spasm, and his veins bulged like they were about to burst. His screams were like nothing I had ever heard before. When it was over, he was dead, his body contorted in a gruesome rictus of pain. There were also the psychological experiments. They would lock subjects in dark rooms for days, depriving them of food and water, playing mind games to see how long they could last before breaking. Some subjects never recovered, their minds shattered beyond repair. Others turned violent, attacking anyone who came near them. I saw one guy rip his own eyes out after being subjected to weeks of sensory deprivation. They just carted him off and brought in the next subject. As if the experiments weren't too bad enough, there was the paranormal shit. The lab was built on some old ground, and the locals always warned us it was cursed. I thought it was just superstitious crap, but after a few months I started to believe it. Lights would flicker, shadows moved on their own, and you could hear whispers in the empty hallways. There was one night I'll never forget. I was working late, trying to finish some reports. Everyone else had gone home, and it was just me in the office. Suddenly the temperature dropped and I could see my breath. Then the whispers started. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but they got louder and clearer. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like a mix of Russian and some older language. I noped the fuck out of there and never stayed late again. Another time we had a series of power outages that lasted for days. During that time, people reported seeing strange figures in the hallways, shadows that didn't belong to anyone, and the feeling of being watched. One of the guards swore he saw a woman in a white dress standing at the end of a corridor. When he approached her, she vanished, and he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He quit the next day. There were also the dreams. Almost everyone at Kholm-24 had them. Nightmares of being chased, of drowning, of being buried alive. Some people would wake up with scratches and bruises that they couldn't explain. Others reported seeing ghostly figures standing at the foot of their beds. I started having those dreams too. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, feeling like something was in the room with me. People went missing all the time at Kholm-24. It became almost routine to hear that someone hadn't shown up for their shift or had vanished during the night. Officially, it was always brushed off as accidents or desertions, but we all knew better. There was this one guy, Pavel. He was a security guard, tough as nails. One night, he was doing his rounds and we heard this blood-curdling scream over the intercom. By the time we got to his post, he was gone. The only thing left was his flashlight, covered in blood. No body, no sign of a struggle, just gone. A few days later, his wife got a package. Inside was his wedding ring and a note that just said, "He s with us now." We also had a rash of murders. The official line was that it was rogue experiments or escaped prisoners, but the brutality of the killings was beyond human. Bodies torn apart, limbs missing, and organs arranged in strange patterns. It felt ritualistic, like some sick offering. There was one particularly gruesome case. A lab technician named Olga was found in one of the storage rooms. Her body was mutilated beyond recognition. Her limbs were arranged in a pentagram and her heart was missing. They never found out who did it, but everyone suspected it was one of the failed experiments. After that, we were all on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next attack. One night, I was in the break room with a few colleagues when we heard a loud crash from one of the labs. We ran to see what had happened and found the door ripped off its hinges. Inside, the room was trashed, equipment smashed, and blood smeared on the walls. There was no sign of the scientist who had been working there, but we found his ID badge in a pool of blood. Security locked down the facility, but they never found the culprit. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The creatures were the worst part. Some were failed experiments, things that should never have existed. Others, I don't know what they were. There were rumors that Kholm-24 was a portal or some kind of gateway, and these things came from the other side. I remember one escape vividly. We called it the Incident. One of the hybrid creatures broke out of containment. It looked like a mix between a man and a wolf, with claws that could tear through steel. It tore through the lab, killing everyone in its path. We managed to lock it in Sector 5, but not before it killed a dozen people. After the incident, the higher-ups decided to tighten security. More guards, more protocols, but it didn't stop the creatures from getting out. We lost so many people during my time there, I stopped keeping track. Another time, they brought in a creature that looked like a giant insect. It had 6 legs, each one ending in a sharp point, and its eyes glowed a sickly green. They kept it in a reinforced cage, but it still managed to escape. It went on a rampage, killing several scientists and guards before they finally managed to contain it again. I saw it up close once, and the way it looked at me, like it was sizing me up, still gives me chills. There were also the things that we never managed to capture. They were like shadows, flickering at the edge of your vision. Sometimes you'd hear footsteps behind you, but when you turned around, there was nothing there. One of the scientists claimed he saw one of these shadow creatures step out of a wall and disappear into another. We laughed it off at the time, but now I'm not so sure. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the nightmares, the guilt of what I was a part of. I started planning my escape. It wasn't easy. The lab was surrounded by wilderness for miles and the winters were deadly. But I didn't care. Anything was better than staying. One night, during a particularly bad storm, I made my move. I stole a security pass and slipped out. The cold was like knives against my skin, but I kept going. I wandered for days, surviving on snow and whatever scraps I could find. Eventually, a group of hunters found me, half frozen and delirious. They took me to the nearest town, and I never looked back. The journey was treacherous. The snowstorm had created near whiteout conditions, and I had to rely on my sense of direction and the scant light of the moon to find my way. The sound of the wind was deafening, howling like the ghosts of the lab coming to drag me back. I fell multiple times. My body weakened from the lack of food and the biting cold. Each step felt like an eternity, but the thought of what lay behind me pushed me forward. I remember stumbling across an abandoned cabin. It provided some shelter from the storm, but the inside was just as cold as outside. I managed to start a fire with some old newspapers and broken furniture. The warmth was a brief respite, but I knew I couldn't stay there long. The place felt wrong, like someone or something was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, even out in the middle of nowhere. After 2 more days of trudging through the snow, I saw smoke in the distance. It was the hunters' camp. They were suspicious of me at first, a half-dead stranger appearing out of the storm, but they took pity on me and helped me recover. I didn't tell them much about Kholm-24, just that I had been part of a government project and had to get away. They provided me with food, warm clothing, and a ride to the nearest town. I've been trying to live a normal life since then, but it's hard. The nightmares are still there, and I can just shake the feeling that something from Kholm-24 is still watching me. I changed my name, moved to a different country, but the past has a way of catching up. Every now and then I hear about strange disappearances or mutilated bodies found in remote areas, and I can't help but wonder if it's something from the lab. I don't know if anyone will believe my story, but I had to get it out there. I found a small town in Eastern Europe to settle down in, far away from the icy grip of Siberia. It's quiet here, and the people keep to themselves. I took up work as a handyman, doing odd jobs around the village. It's not much, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. But even here, in this seemingly peaceful place, I can to escape the shadows of my past. Sometimes I'll see a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a whisper in a language I don't understand. The locals have their own superstitions and tales of dark forests and haunted houses, but none of it compares to what I saw at Kholm-24. They don't ask too many questions, and for that, I am grateful. I tried to reach out to a few former colleagues, hoping to find someone else who survived and escaped. Most of them were dead-ends people who had disappeared without a trace, or were found dead under mysterious circumstances. It felt like the lab's curse followed us, no matter how far we ran. One day, I received a letter. No return address, just my name scrawled on the envelope in a shaky hand. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message: "They know you're still alive." It was signed with a name I recognized, Dr. Ivanov. My heart raced as I read the words. If Ivanov was still alive, it meant the lab was still operational and they were hunting down anyone who knew too much. Not long after receiving the letter, I started noticing unfamiliar faces in the village. They were outsiders like me, but there was something off about them. They asked too many questions, lingered too long in places they shouldn't be. I kept a low profile, but it was clear they were looking for someone. For me. One night, I woke up to the sound of my front door creaking open. I grabbed the knife I kept under my pillow and crept downstairs. 2 men were in my living room, rifling through my belongings. They didn't see me at first, so I managed to surprise them. I held the knife to one man's throat and demanded to know who they were. They claimed to be government agents, but I knew better. Their accents were Russian, and their demeanor was too calm, too practiced. They were trained for this. They tried to convince me to come with them, saying they could protect me, but I knew they were lying. I had seen what happened to those who trusted the people behind Kholm-24. I knocked one out and managed to escape through the back door. I ran to the edge of the village, hiding in the woods until dawn. The next day I packed what little I had and left town. I couldn't stay in one place for too long. They would keep coming until they found me. Being on the run isn't easy. I moved from place to place, never staying more than a few months in one spot. I used fake names, paid in cash, and avoided anyone who seemed too curious about my past. The paranoia was suffocating, but it was better than being caught. I made contact with a group of ex-military types who specialized in disappearing people. They helped me change my identity, provided me with new documents, and taught me how to stay off the grid. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it bought me some time. I found myself in a small coastal town in Spain, far from the frozen wastelands of Siberia. The warm weather and friendly locals were a welcome change. I even started to feel a bit of normalcy returning to my life, but the nightmares never stopped. Every night, I would relive the horrors of Kholm-24, the experiments, the creatures, the screams of the damned. One night, I had a particularly vivid nightmare. I was back in the lab, standing in front of one of the containment cells. Inside was a creature, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It spoke to me in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers. "You can run forever," it said. "We will find you." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The message was clear: they were still looking for me, and they wouldn't stop until they had me. I couldn't even let them capture me. I knew too much, and if they took me back, I wouldn't survive. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't keep running forever, and I couldn't let the people behind Kholm-24 continue their work. I had to find a way to stop them. I reached out to a few old contacts, people who had connections in the intelligence community. With their help, I gathered information on the lab's current operations and locations. It took months of planning, but I finally had a plan. I would infiltrate Kholm-24 and gather evidence of their activities. With enough proof, I could expose them to the world and bring an end to their atrocities. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance I had. I made my way back to Siberia, using forged documents and bribes to get past the border. The journey was harrowing, but I was determined. When I finally reached the outskirts of the lab, I felt a chill run down my spine. The place looked the same as when I left, but it felt even more sinister. I snuck into the facility under cover of darkness, using the knowledge I had from my time there to avoid detection. The inside was a maze of corridors and rooms, but I knew where to find what I needed. I made my way to the records room, where they kept detailed logs of all the experiments and activities. As I sifted through the files, I found evidence of even more horrific experiments. They had continued their work on human-animal hybrids, and the results were even more monstrous than before. They were also experimenting with mind control and telekinesis, using drugs and radiation to try and unlock hidden abilities in their subjects. I gathered as much evidence as I could, but just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps approaching. I hid behind a stack of boxes, holding my breath as 2 guards walked in. They were talking about a new project, something they called Project Lazarus. From what I could gather, it was a way to bring the dead back to life, using a combination of genetic engineering and dark rituals. The guards left, and I made my escape. I had what I needed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I made my way to a safe house where I contacted my allies and sent them the evidence. It was out of my hands now. All I could do was wait and hope that the truth would come to light. The fallout was immediate. News of Kholm-24's activities spread like wildfire, and the world was outraged. Governments condemned the experiments, and calls for justice rang out from every corner. The lab was shut down, and several high-ranking officials were arrested. But it wasn't over. Despite the shutdown, rumors persisted that some of the scientists had escaped, taking their research with them. There were whispers of underground labs and secret experiments continuing in remote locations. The creatures, too, were still out there. Some had escaped during the chaos, and reports of strange sightings and attacks began to surface. I knew I couldn't rest easy. The battle was far from over, and the shadows of Kholm-24 would haunt me for the rest of my life. But at least I had taken a stand, and for now, that was enough. Stay safe, X. There are things out there that are worse than you can imagine.